climbs and on through currents and throbbing seas. Winds blowing through breathing trees and strong ozone and safe sunshine. Good planets are hard to find, yeah.
Hello, K-Squid listeners. It's every other Sunday again, and you're listening to Sustainability Now, a bi-weekly K-Squid radio show focused on environment, sustainability, and social justice in the Monterey Bay region, California, and the world. I'm your host, Ronnie Lipschutz. The world's climate is changing, and it is changing more and more rapidly. What are we to do? If you've been paying attention to the media, you might have heard about the 27th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, now going on in Sharm El-Sheikh, Egypt. There are some 200 governments represented at the conference, along with 30,000 attendees, so it is quite the party.
And carbon capture is not new in that sense. It's been around for decades, but it has never been there's a great thing this time. We will have to make sure this becomes business.
This is actually the 30th such meeting, beginning with the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. So the world's governments have been wrestling with the challenge of climate change for more than 30 years, with precious little to show for all of that. My guests today are Dr. Sander Chan and Andrew Deneau, who are at the conference observing and conducting research. Sander Chan is a senior researcher at the Global Center on Adaptation, Research, and Innovation Hub in Groningen, Netherlands, and an assistant professor at Radboud University in Nijmegen, the Netherlands. Andrew Deneau is a researcher in environmental governance at IDOS, the German Institute of Development and Sustainability in Bonn, Germany. Well, Sander Chan and Andrew Deneau, welcome to Sustainability Now.
Thank you. Thank you.
In my introduction to the show, I explained what the Conference of the Parties is, but perhaps you could try to describe the conference setting, who attends, what kinds of events and activities have been happening, and maybe even what are the goals of the conference?
Yeah, so you might expect that, the COP is negotiations between governments. So you would expect a lot of government representatives, and that is indeed the case. But I would say that, in fact, you will see more people from civil society, from businesses, and also people kind of belonging to the media. There's a big media center here who are also walking around here. And in fact, at this COP, the moment you enter, you first see a huge media center on your right, and then you go through different halls and tents where you see a lot of exhibits and pavilions. And I think there's about like 500 side events going on at the COP. And side events are kind of events that are not negotiations, that are kind of organized on the side by civil society, by businesses, by so-called observers of this process. So I think over the last year, I would say over the last decade, like these side events have grown so much in numbers and in size that you could almost say that it has become the main event. You see that the negotiations themselves are, of course, important, but more than anything, COP seems to be like this annually kind of returning, traveling climate circus.
And back in 1995, this was when the first COP was held in Berlin. There were about 4,000 attendees. Last year in Glasgow, we had almost 40,000. And half of these were media, NGO observers, international organizations. So now COP is a place for all of these other actors to get together. And since 2014, we've seen the launch of over 29,000 climate commitments by all types of actors, more than 600 initiatives. And I think the total is around 70,000 actors. So it's really grown on the non-state actor side.
I like that term, climate circus. I noted that this is actually the 30th meeting if you start with the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. And I actually attended one of the preparatory conferences to all of this I think it was in 90 or 91 in Geneva. And I'm sure there weren't nearly that many people in attendance then. So what are you allowed to attend the formal sessions?
Yeah, I mean, there's always kind of closed door meetings
Right.
where parties being governments, of course, prepare the negotiations, and of course we're not allowed there. But in principle, we are in what is called the blue zone, and the blue zone is kind of the restricted area where all the negotiations take place, where the so-called official side events take place. And these are the side events that are acknowledged or kind of have been given the okay by the UNFCCC Secretariat. So this is kind of the most important quote unquote part of the COP venue. But the COP venue is even bigger because there's also a green zone where more people are allowed in. And I am not too often in the green zone, but the times I have been there, it feels like a trade fair. You see all kinds of companies like with stands and, showing off their latest products and innovations. And this green zone is often open to a much larger public.
Hmm. Well, have you attended any previous conferences, COP conferences?
Yeah, I have. So this is my 8th COP. My very first one was in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
That was in Lima, in Peru. It was a very important COP because that was the COP that kind of prepared the way to the Paris Agreement, which was the year after. So I think, having been in COPs for the last 8 years was very good for me because I could see what was before the Paris Agreement, what happened during the Paris Agreement in the Paris negotiations in 2015, and how it has since developed. Before the COP in Paris in 2015, there was a lot of anxiety about whether governments would reach any diplomatic agreement, really. And 2015, 2016, I felt like there was this more positive vibe because, we have achieved a big diplomatic breakthrough where almost 200 countries have, agreed on an agreement that on paper looks quite ambitious, wanting to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. But I also feel like, as we are moving into implementing the Paris Agreement, more and more question marks are raised at the moment. First of all, we haven't seen that governments have, upped their ambitions a lot since 2015. So, if we look at what governments do at COPs and what they promise at COPs since 2015, it doesn't add up. It doesn't add up if we want to achieve the Paris goals. And I think this year is also interesting because we're kind of 1 year before what is called the global stocktake. So the global stocktake will happen next year, and that is where countries will collectively see whether they are on track to meeting the Paris climate goals, whether they are on track to limiting global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. And they do that by looking at what is collectively promised, what all governments have brought to the table. So it's very important between now and next year that governments really, increase their climate targets, and that makes this COP particularly interesting. And also, last year we had the COP in Glasgow in the UK. There we saw an unprecedented number of non-state actors. I refer to non-state actors, businesses and investors and civil society actors, also cities, regions, local actors. Like an unprecedented number of these types of actors have, come forward and promised to take climate action, to build adaptive capacity, but also to become climate neutral, for instance, by the turn of by mid-century. And impressive though it may be, all these promises, by now we should see some evidence that these pledges are leading to some action, that there's some, movement towards keeping those promises. So in that sense, I think this is an interesting COP.
Let's come back to that. But before we go on, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourselves, where you work, what you do, how you got interested in this particular topic.
Sure. I'm Andrew Deneau. I'm at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, or IDAS, in Bonn, Germany. It's a research policy and training think tank. And we're interested in the interface between development and environment. So in our research, we look at transnational action and its role in mitigating and adapting to climate change, with a particular focus on the Global South. At COP27, we've got several events. One is an official side event. It's called Bringing Nature-Based Climate Action into Cities in Challenging Times. The event is exciting for us because we've brought together a diversity of people, researchers, local practitioners, policymakers, and from multiple countries. The event is about climate actions which have benefits for nature, biodiversity, and society. And one example is rewilding cities. So increasing plant and animal species complexity in urban environments to adapt to climate change, to reduce pollution, to reduce environmental management costs, and cool areas of cities.
How did you end up at IDAS?
I was interning at UNFCCC after my second master, and I was in an area that was tracking non-state climate action. It's part of their Global Climate Action Portal. That's where I was working. And Sander was regularly at the building meeting with my supervisor and I. So this is how we connected.
And Sander, how about you? What's your, background and where do you work?
Yeah, so my background is actually in political science, and I'm a researcher at Radboud University in the Netherlands. And I did my PhD years ago looking at the role of public-private cooperation in sustainable development, specifically also looking at China. And by the time I finalized my PhD, I heard from someone that the UNFCCC, the UN Climate Secretariat, were looking to engage the private sector through public-private partnerships ahead of the Paris Climate Conference. So at that point, I was triggered because I was a little bit concerned. I've been looking at these public-private partnerships for a couple of years during my PhDs, and I saw that a lot of them were greenwashing. A lot of them, were kind of distracting from government inaction, and also a lot of the partnerships that were presented as sustainable development partnerships, they just didn't deliver. So at that time, I wrote a letter to the UN Climate Secretariat, and I offered to help them out. So they actually responded within a week.
Wow.
So like in a week's time, I briefly joined, like for a couple of months, the UNFCCC Secretariat, and helped them to kind of design this engagement agenda for climate action, to kind of design the agenda in a way that it could actually, help climate action forward instead of becoming kind of a graveyard of good intentions, or a podium for greenwashing. So after I left the Secretariat, like I still felt concern over, this agenda. It was called the Lima Paris Action Agenda, and that morphed into what we know as global climate action today. And I was still concerned about like how these actions would develop. So I started to track these initiatives, and I build a platform, a database to kind of, see how these initiatives are developing over time. And by now that's a big database. I think the biggest database on transnational climate action at the moment. And I think that work is still relevant. In fact, the reason why we are in Egypt is that we see more engagement by investors, businesses, and all these actors more than ever. I think part of the role of us as researchers is also to, not only emphasize the potential of all that engagement, but also warn against putting too much faith in these kind of engagements. Some of them will be greenwashing, and they will not always materialize in any real environmental impact. And also, the most vulnerable people are not likely to benefit from these climate actions. So, we're here to kind of keep an eye on these initiatives, also to provide evidence and to advise on how to best engage these actions or not to engage these actions. For instance, one thing that I notice is that a lot of people, when they think about climate action, especially also around the UNFCCC, around the Climate Secretariat, when they think about climate action, often they think about emissions reduction, right? But a singular focus on emissions reduction is just a very bad idea. You need to consider adaptation as well. You need to consider as well, what the impacts are for developing countries.
Hello, Casewood listeners. This is Ronnie Lipschitz, and you're listening to Sustainability Now. My guests today are Sandra Chen and Andrew Deneau, who are attending the 27th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Sharm El-Sheikh, Egypt. And we've been talking about various issues having to do with the conferences and what they're trying to accomplish. So you mentioned that your skepticism about achieving actual goals, meaningful goals. And I'm wondering, in your view, have these 27 or 30 years of negotiation actually produced any kinds of significant outcomes, in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of adaptation, and so on?
Yeah, so I think this is the most important question. Is there any kind of environmental problem solving going on here? And I would say, like, the biggest successes over the last 25 to 30 years were mostly diplomatic successes, right? So undeniably, I think it has been a success that you get 200 almost 200 countries to agree to a Paris Agreement. But this is all kind of institutional or political effectiveness, and what we are really waiting for is a clear path towards avoiding dangerous climate change, which is kind of the goal of the UN Climate Framework Convention. And throughout the years, I think different things have been tried out. In 1997, for instance, the COP was in Kyoto. Governments have tried out to basically divide responsibilities, right? We know how much we need to reduce. So you can simply make a calculation and calculate how much everyone should reduce in terms of, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. If everyone keeps by that, then, we have maybe solved the problem. But, in practice, it doesn't really work that way. Part of the reasons is that, who is responsible for the current emissions, the current share of carbon that we have in the atmosphere at the moment. Developing countries are definitely not as much responsible for what we see now than developed countries. So in Kyoto, you also saw that, we are dividing responsibilities, but we only divide responsibilities among the rich developed nations. So in a way that is fair. On the other hand, that's not enough. India and China are also emerging economies with growing emissions. And if they don't take part in reducing emissions, then, we still haven't solved the problems. In fact, their emissions growth at that time was so much faster. It didn't keep up with, the Kyoto reductions didn't keep up. I think what was also tried out in Kyoto was market mechanisms, right? It introduced so-called flexible mechanisms. I think the most important of which is a clean development mechanism, in which rich countries could invest in projects in poorer countries to reduce emissions, and those emissions reductions would then count towards the investing country. And also countries that reduce more than their targets, they could sell their emissions allowance to other countries. And this is literally kind of trade in hot air, and obviously received a lot of criticism by environmentalists. So that was definitely in a way, an experiment, maybe a dangerous experiment with market mechanisms that just didn't bring us much in terms of emissions reduction. The reason for it is also largely political, right? The U.S., then President George W. Bush, didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol because the U.S. just didn't like to have binding targets, and they feared that, it would increase costs for U.S. industry, and China, for instance, would benefit from it. Without the biggest emitter at that time, the U.S., it was impossible for the Kyoto Protocol to deliver any emissions at scale, really.
Maybe it's important to note here for our listeners that although these agreements are international, it falls to the individual governments to take action to reduce emissions. And so there's nothing really binding about the international agreement. It's essentially that countries have to decide they're going to pass legislation, they're going to impose various kinds of restrictions and regulations. And of course, domestic politics then comes to play an enormous role in whether a country does anything or not.
Right, and I think there was also kind of one hard lesson that was learned kind of, with the Kyoto Protocol. And what is interesting, though, is that since 2009, since the conference in the COPs in the COP in Copenhagen, we see that we're trying out something else. and that is not kind of dividing responsibilities, not making the calculation and divide like who has to do what, but to kind of see what governments and countries can do in terms of climate action in their own countries. So I think the Copenhagen COP in 2009 was, is actually kind of remembered as a big failure, right? Governments were meant to, reach a new comprehensive climate agreement and define targets and timetables. Now, this all didn't happen. What happened instead was that the US, China, Brazil, and South Africa in a back room, they drafted a political statement, the Copenhagen Accord, without any emissions targets. Part of that Copenhagen Accord was that countries could voluntarily kind of commit climate targets, including developing countries, so including China and India. So for the first time, these large emitting countries, they kind of opened the possibility that they would actually contribute to emissions reduction. But overall, the Copenhagen Accord is not an agreement between all countries under the UNFCCC. So it was really not the agreement that they were going for, and therefore it's seen as a failure. But I would say that that's where the experiment began, like the experiment of basically having a potluck dinner where you have all these countries kind of bringing their contribution to the table, and in the end we hope that we have enough to eat, that we keep global warming limited to, at that time, 2 degrees. And in fact, if you look at the Paris Agreement, it actually is building on this Copenhagen Accord, because it also acts by that same logic where governments around the world, they submit their own pledges, their own climate pledges, so-called nationally determined contributions. So this bottom-up logic was also in place, is also in place in the Paris Agreement. The guiding logic now is not dividing responsibilities, but looking at the ability of individual countries to make contributions. So that is what you also refer to, I think, when you say, well, it's about national politics, really.
Yeah. Well, let's switch a little bit. This morning, I read in the San Francisco Chronicle that yesterday the UN Secretary General warned the conference that the world is on, quote, a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. And what did he mean by that?
Yeah, I think, what he says there really reflects what I see, where the discussion is evolving also in the scientific community. We recently, at the IPCC report, and a famous an important part of the IPCC report is a graph that shows the reasons of concern, right?
Tell us what IPCC is, just for our listeners.
So that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that is actually a kind of a peer review process of exist. So what they try to do is they provide authoritative evidence on climate change, the drivers of climate change, and also the impacts of climate change. And it involves like a couple of thousands of researchers that review everything that is published in the area of climate change, to kind of draw conclusions on where we're heading, what the likelihood is of climate change, what the likelihood is of certain impacts. And on the basis of that, IPCC synthesizes this knowledge in their reports. These are assessment reports, and they happen every couple of years. So I think we're working towards the next assessment report again. But one element that has been a returning element in this report are the reasons for concerns. And the reasons for concerns refer to kind of the risk to ecosystems, the risk of severe climate events, the risk of distributed and impacts around the world, the risk of economic and ecological impacts, and how irreversible they might be, and at what temperatures. So that report shows that at 1.5 degrees, we will already see irreversible consequences. So, for instance, coastal and polar and mountain communities and ecosystems, and virtual all coral reef will be affected, and the coral reefs will disappear. Mm-hmm. Already, but with 1.5 degrees warming, we are at about 1 degrees warming now. And beyond that, our measures to adapt, to cope with climate change will become increasingly ineffective. So in short, once we are above 1.5 degrees, the consequences of climate change will be drastically more severe, and our ability to cope with it diminishes.
You're listening to Sustainability Now. I'm Ronnie Lipschitz, and my guests today are Dr. Sander Chen and Andrew Deneau, who are attending the 27th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Sharm El-Sheikh, Egypt. And we've just been talking about what the prospects are in terms of climate change if we don't start to act meaningfully on emissions and on adaptation. So I interrupted you, Sander. Do you remember where you were?
Yeah, so I was talking about like the consequences of even at 1.5 degrees warming. But the truth is that currently, if we look at our policies, we're on course for 2 to 4 degrees warming. So many have argued that in fact these scenarios are very conservative, and they assume too much like these politically defined goals of 1.5 and 2 degrees, and the likelihood that warming will exceed and even far exceed these temperature goals, is real. So you also see, and that is, I think, the road to hell that the UN Secretary General referred to. You see the shift in the scientific discussion, where a couple of years ago, Will Steffen at the Australian National University and colleagues, they warned against a hothouse Earth scenario. So that is a scenario where at 2 degrees warming, you lock in future warming, and that is irreversible. You will have a kind of constant reinforcement of heating, and this will lead to extreme scenarios, like apocalyptic scenarios of mass extinction, and oceans will become dead zones. And by now, 2022, some scientists are openly talking about human extinction. So earlier this year, Luke Kemp in Cambridge University and colleagues published this paper called The Climate Endgame. And they describe how a sudden shift in climate in the climatic conditions here could trigger failures that actually unravel societies and that will exacerbate conflicts and the spread of infectious diseases and cause economic stress, loss of land and water, and food insecurity. So these impacts, they play out probably simultaneously or in connection to one another. So what you get is a bundle of system-wide cascading failures. Maybe a good comparison might be the COVID-19 pandemic, although comparatively, the COVID-19 pandemic is mild. But by now, we cannot really tell whether the COVID-19 pandemic was a health crisis, an economic crisis, a social crisis, everything kind of seems to be happening at the same time at the moment. It's also become an energy crisis by now. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, you can think of what scientists talk about are what we would call natural feedbacks, right? Positive feedbacks. But there are also social and political feedbacks, which I know the IPCC tries to take into account, but I don't think they do it terribly well. And I'm thinking about the apocalyptic scenario. There's also going to be multiplication of all of these catastrophes by those social and political feedbacks. I mean, if you talk about food insecurity, right, what happened between Russia and Ukraine, Russia blocking grain shipments and its impact on the Horn of Africa, for example, right? That's a social political feedback, which could multiply other kinds of droughts and things like that, right?
Yeah, and I mean, what's really disturbing, I think, is the thought that civilizations have fallen over less climatic change. And I think I live in a rich country, you too. And we might think of ourselves as, relatively sheltered from climate impacts, or we're rich and everything. But I really wonder whether we're really that more resilient against climate impacts than a lot of poor countries are. In Europe, we have seen like this massive political backlash against migrants, as soon as people had to flee, partly also because of climate-induced events and conflicts that are exacerbated by climate change. So yeah, we need to pay more attention to the catastrophic scenarios and not only kind of think of the politically defined goals of 1.5 and 2 degrees.
Well, let's turn to your work, okay? Maybe there's a little bit more optimism there. You're focusing on what you call orchestrated and transnational climate action. So what do those terms mean, concretely? What and who are these people?
So we're studying international and transnational initiatives, and we define them as collaboration across borders with 2 or more actors, and one of whom is a transnational actor. So these could be businesses in Canada and the US, perhaps implementing in a third country. It could be businesses, organizations, civil society organizations in one country implementing in multiple others. But there's an international aspect. It's across countries, and it includes these transnational or non-state and subnational actors. So transnational action could be the outcome of orchestration. And what do we mean by orchestration? These are governments and international organizations activating society. They're bringing together societal and transnational stakeholders. And again, these include those businesses, investors, local communities, etc. And this form of governance is contrasted to the typical one that we're used to, which is top-down. Governments set regulations to enforce change. that might not always work because the non-governmental actors might not feel ownership over these externally defined goals. Also, the governments might lack specifics like what's going on the ground and other sectoral knowledge. So the solutions that they come up with may not be the most effective. In practice, traditional government's not obsolete. We need regulations, but governments cannot relinquish their responsibility and just point to the private sector. So really, it's about all these actors working together.
So transnational is the sort of variable, or no, it's not the variable, it's the constant. So you're not counting all kinds of, groups and actions and projects that are domestic and don't have transnational components, right? Of which there must be hundreds of thousands.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we focus on these transnational actions because so much hope is invested in these transnational actions in at the global level. But one consequence is that a lot of action that is more local and happening on the ground, especially in developing countries, are not recognized or remain under the radar. So one of the things that we also try to do with, for instance, partners in India and Kenya is to find out, what kind of climate actions are going on in those countries. So one thing that we found out in Kenya, for instance, is that and I think if I remember well, like about 80% of stock listed companies on the Nairobi Stock Exchange, they committed to some kind of climate action, right? And also one thing about climate action in the global south is it might not be called climate action. It might not be identified explicitly as climate action, right? Because for instance, building resilience or protecting people from food insecurity has always been a concern in the Horn of Africa, right? And a lot of kind of decentralized energy generation could count as climate action, but is not identified as such. So you're absolutely right. There's much more going on that is under the radar of governments and international organizations, and us as well, I have to say.
You're listening to Sustainability Now. I'm Ronnie Lipschitz, and my guests today are Dr. Sander Chen and Andrew Deneau, who are attending the 27th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Sharm El-Sheikh, Egypt. You mentioned, I think, earlier that 29,000 climate actions have been documented since 2014. And what is your sense of the effectiveness of these climate actions? Why are they achieving goals or not? And why has the international, the UN turned to these, to this particular mechanism for trying to achieve goals? I mean, you've talked about that a little bit, but maybe you can expand on it.
Yeah. So I think, the question is out there, like what the additionality is of these initiatives. Well, first, there's kind of concern over whether these initiatives in fact substitute governmental action. So that could happen, for instance, when governments just basically deny responsibility and kind of pass on responsibilities to the private sector. But I think that at the moment we also find that in the case of climate action, we see a lot of this non-state or transnational action happening in kind of the territories of governments that are relatively ambitious. So we don't see this substitution necessarily. We see that a lot of climate action by non-state actors happens when governments are also more ambitious, and I think partly this has to do with the fact that governments have also seen the use of non-state action. As I said, under the Paris Agreement, governments kind of propose their own targets voluntarily. So the question is no longer about substitution. The question now is can we kind of drum up as much action as possible because it helps the government to achieve targets. So non-state action actually becomes useful for governments. In some cases, we do see substitution. So in the case of the Trump administration, for instance, when Trump announced a withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, what you saw was kind of the reverse substitution, where a lot of non-state and local and non-governmental actors have stepped up and said, no matter what the federal government does, we will abide by the Paris Agreement and we will keep the pledge that was made by the federal government or even exceed it. So in that sense, I think these climate actions, these transnational climate actions, have played a very important role, and potentially, actually, these initiatives could help us towards a pathway that is consistent with limiting global warming to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees Celsius. Actually, last year we have assessed the potential emissions reduction of just a few large-scale international cooperative initiatives that are registered with UN Environment and the UN Climate Secretariat. And what we found is that if these actions are fully implemented, they would reduce emissions by about 16 gigatons a year by 2030. What does that mean? It means basically that we bridge the gap to 2 degrees. So if these initiatives are fully implemented by 2030, we would be on track to limiting global warming to 2 degrees. So obviously, this is big news. I mean, and this gives a lot of hope. I have to say, however, that, assuming the full implementation is a very big assumption. And already in our analysis last year, we found that, at least half of this potential is in question because initiatives are behind schedule in terms of where they should be in terms of their achieving their targets and where they actually are. Mm-hmm. And many of them don't even report progress against targets. So they might as well be greenwashing.
Yeah.
So, I think that kind of underlines the importance of tracking these actions and doing research and understanding what they are actually achieving, not only looking at their potential impacts. But I want to add one more thing, maybe. Of course, in a direct sense, what these initiatives reduce in emissions is important, but it might not even be the most important effect, because these initiatives, if they are successful, they could generate kind of catalytic impacts. Yeah. They could engage more and more actors. They could lead to more and more action on climate change. At least that is the hope, right? And cumulatively, that will, bring us further towards, a low carbon and climate resilient future. And that is, I think, the hope and the dominant narrative about these transnational actions.
Well, I mean, as you mentioned the Trump administration, but it strikes me that these kinds of actions have been going on in the United States for much longer out of frustration with the federal government, whoever happens to be in office. Because again, presidents have to deal with Congress, and I mean, George W. was a somewhat of a disbeliever, but I mean, even Bill Clinton had to, you know, pay attention to Congress as well as the domestic constituency. I don't know what it's like in other countries, but anyway, listen, we're coming to the end of our time together, and I was wondering if there's anything you might like to add or mention that hasn't come up.
Yeah, sure. I can, if I can, I'll just summarize some key points from the research in the last few years.
Sure.
So overall, looking at these initiatives, about 601, we're finding poor performance in the past few years, and more so for adaptation focused or initiatives that are looking at adapting to the effects of climate change. As well, in a recent paper, we identified qualities associated with higher performance. And when we look at whether new initiatives launched this year or last have these qualities, it's fewer than the others. And then finally, we're not seeing benefits accrue to the global south. And this is something that we'll continue to study.
Yeah, so I think as we leave, in almost 2 weeks, when we leave Sharm El-Sheikh, I kind of hope that there's evidence that there's kind of delivery on promises, that there's evidence that these initiatives that have been launched, for instance, last year, actually are well resourced, have clear targets and timetables, so that they are likely to really make an environmental impact. Because I feel like these COPs, they have become so big, they have become a circus, they almost provide a stage for theater, for kind of showing off, what your good intentions are. But that is not enough. Like we also need to, I think we need to have a podium to show not only like good intentions, but also how bring back, for instance, initiatives that have been launched a couple of years ago, and have them tell us what they have achieved. And if they haven't achieved so, there's no shame in that. But what does it take for them to keep their promises, right? So I think leaving COP, I hope that we learn from non-state actor engagement, and we learn from past experience how to do this better, how to more effectively support and galvanize the potential in societal actors.
Sander Chan and Andrew Deneau, thank you so much for being my guests on Sustainability Now. That was quite informative and educational.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
If you'd like to listen to previous shows, you can find them at ksquid.org/sustainabilitynow and Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Pocket Casts, among other podcast sites. So thanks for listening, and thanks to all the staff and volunteers who make K-Squid your community radio station and keep it going. And so, until next every other Sunday, Sustainability Now.